Over the holiday period, Russia continued its daily attacks against mostly civilian targets in Ukraine. For example, on December 29 a massive barrage of missile strikes and drone attacks hit infrastructure facilities in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Lviv, Odessa, and government-controlled areas of the contested Donetsk Oblast. Similar attacks continued for several days and show no sign of abating in the new year. This prompted the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, to warn that Russia was probably planning a prolonged air campaign aimed at exhausting Ukraine. This lack of Russian progress is particularly telling in the case of Bakhmut, a small city in Donbass, that has been relentlessly attacked by regular and irregular Russian forces for months, but has been ably defended and thus remains firmly in Ukrainian hands. During his visit to the US in December, Zelensky was able to obtain an additional $1.85 billion £1.5 billion security assistance package. Critically, this includes a Patriot air defense system, something Ukraine has long coveted. On top of that, Ukraine has had some remarkable successes on the battlefield as well of late. These include successful drone strikes against air bases in Russia in December and a missile strike against Russian troop concentration area in Makiivka, close to Donetsk in eastern Ukraine on New Year's Day. In addition, Ukrainian forces have degraded Russian supply lines and made some territorial gains in Donbass over recent weeks. China has been careful in balancing its ideological proximity to Putin's Russia with its economic ties with Ukraine's Western partners. But at a video summit between Putin and Xi Jinping at the end of December, the Chinese president stressed Beijing's preparedness to increase its strategic cooperation with Moscow. KYIV Ukraine. Ever since President Putin's forces began massing on Ukraine's border, the West has been obsessed with how to mount a defense of the country without provoking Russia into escalating the conflict. That vacillation included the US and European allies declining Kyiv's requests for Patriot missile systems, tanks, and other medium and long-range missiles to fight off the invading army. The West feared that attacks on Russian territory would create an explosive reaction from the Kremlin that could even result in the use of nuclear weapons. Soldiers of the 59th Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces fired Grad missiles on Russian positions in Russia-occupied Donbass region on December 30, 2022 in Donetsk, Ukraine. Podolyak is happy to admit that Ukraine has intensified assaults against territory annexed by Russia. This is something Putin views as a powerful escalation, especially when the attacks are on land he grabbed back in 2014 and considers to be fully part of Russia. On the first day of 2023, the Russian Defense Ministry's television channel, Zvezda, reported shooting down 15 Ukrainian drones over more than a dozen regions including the Crimea Peninsula. Crimean residents could hear explosions in Jankoy, a town in the north of the peninsula, on New Year's Eve. Ukraine's popular commander-in-chief, Valery Zaluzhny, has predicted a new Russian attack as early as in January, which could even include another assault on Kyiv or the west of the country. Ukraine's emotional condition is different from the mass panic we saw before the battle for Kyiv last year, when hundreds of thousands fled the country. Many say they are tired of being scared, of running. This is an existential war for Ukraine, and the population seems increasingly united and patriotic. About 90% of all of Ukraine's losses are victims of Russian artillery and multiple launch rocket systems, which Russia is now firing from inside its own borders and out of reach of Ukraine's currently available weapons. A view of the damaged structures, including a clothing and food market and a chemical plant, after the Ukrainian shells struck the Russian town of Belgorod, 10 kilometers from the border with Ukraine. Many deaths and wounded people were reported. Podolyak is convinced that the time has come to cross this red line. Russian President Vladimir Putin on Thursday ordered his armed forces to observe a unilateral 36-hour ceasefire in Ukraine this weekend for the Orthodox Christmas holiday, the first such sweeping truce move in the nearly 11-month-old war. Kyiv indicated it wouldn't follow suit. Zelensky claimed that since he unveiled a peace plan in November, almost 110,000 Russian soldiers have been killed, and he accused the Kremlin of planning the fighting pause to continue the war with renewed vigor. The most comprehensive recent Western estimate of Russia's military losses was from a senior U.S. military official, who said in November that about 100,000 Russian soldiers had been killed or wounded. Russian authorities haven't provided any recent figure for their military casualties. Putin acted after the Russian Orthodox Church head, Patriarch Kirill, proposed a truce from noon Friday through midnight Saturday Moscow time, 9 o'clock GMT Friday to 21 o'clock GMT Saturday, 4 a.m. Eastern Standard Time Friday to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time Saturday. The Orthodox Church, which uses the Julian calendar, celebrates Christmas on January 7th. Germany also said it would supply Marder armored personnel carriers, and France said it will discuss with Ukraine delivery of armored combat vehicles that can destroy tanks. U.S. officials said they will send Ukraine nearly $3 billion in military aid in a new package that will for the first time include several dozen Bradley fighting vehicles. The aim is to get as much aid to Ukrainian forces as possible before spring begins and fighting increases. An announcement was expected Friday, said the officials, who spoke on condition of anonymity because the package's details had not been announced. In the latest fighting, Kyrylo Tymoshenko, deputy head of the Ukrainian presidential office, said Thursday that Russian shelling killed at least 5 civilians and wounded 8 in the previous 24 hours. An intense battle has left 60% of the eastern city of Bakhmut in ruins, Donetsk Governor Pavlo Kyrylenko said. Ukrainian defenders appear to be holding the Russians back. Taking the city in the Donbas region, an expansive industrial area bordering Russia, would not only give Putin a major battlefield gain after months of setbacks but rupture Ukraine's supply lines and allow Moscow's forces to press toward key Ukrainian strongholds in Donetsk. Russia could soon launch a new military offensive, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky warned in a videotaped address earlier this week. He vowed to repel any such effort, which intelligence analysts have been expecting for some time. President Biden, speaking before a cabinet meeting on Thursday, seemed to agree with Zelensky's assessment that the coming weeks could prove crucial, especially as the one-year anniversary of the invasion approaches, putting pressure on Russian President Vladimir Putin and his military chiefs to demonstrate to the Russian public that the costly war has not been for naught. Ukraine's devastating strike on a Russian base in the village of Makiivka, which killed at least 89 soldiers Sunday night, could intensify the Kremlin's desire for a punishing reprisal. This week has seen the United States, France, and Germany all commit to sending armored vehicles to Ukraine, in apparent recognition that the war, now in its 11th month, is approaching a potentially decisive stage. Yet another rout of Russian troops could deepen tensions in Moscow, where few expected the war to last as long as it has. On Thursday, Putin ordered a ceasefire so that frontline troops could mark Christmas, which, under the Julian calendar used by the Russian Orthodox Church, comes in January. Ukraine rejected the offer to stop fighting, with Zelensky advisor Mikhailo Podolyak describing Putin's ceasefire as a cynical trap. Russian President Vladimir Putin said he ordered his defense minister Sergei Shoigu to implement a temporary ceasefire in Ukraine, which was quickly dismissed by Ukrainian authorities as a facade. The so-called Russian ceasefire is set to take effect from midday on January 6 to midnight on January 7 to allow Orthodox Christians to attend Christmas services, according to Russian state media agency RIA Novosti. The truce offer has been met with skepticism from both Kyiv and the West, with many viewing it as a ploy by Putin to regroup. On December 24, Russia launched a rocket strike on central Kherson, the southern city that was liberated in November after 8 months under Russian occupation, killing 10 civilians and wounding 58. On New Year's Eve, Moscow carried out its latest mass missile attack on Ukrainian cities, which resulted in 1 death and 28 injuries around the country. President's office deputy head Kyrylo Tymoshenko reported that Moscow attacked Berislav, Kherson Oblast, shortly after Russia's proposal, killing 3 people, including a 12-year-old child. The General Staff said that Russian forces are focusing their main effort on an attempt to capture the eastern Donetsk Oblast, conducting offensive operations toward Bakhmut and Lyman. Bakhmut, a city with a pre-war population of around 70,000, is one of Russia's primary targets. Seizing it could allow Russian forces to launch attacks on urban areas such as Kramatorsk and Sloviansk in Donetsk Oblast. According to the Ukrainian military, Moscow's forces attacked Bakhmut, 12 settlements nearby, and 4 settlements near Lyman. Russia invaded and occupied parts of the oblasts for the first time in 2014, including the regional capitals of Donetsk and Luhansk. In late December, Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said that Bakhmut is Ukraine's eastern fortress, where Russia has concentrated the most military equipment and weapons. The Belarusian Defense Ministry reported on January 5 that Russian forces continued deploying personnel, weapons, military, and special equipment in Belarus. While Belarus has allowed Russia to use its territory to attack Ukraine, Belarusian troops have not yet been deployed to the front line. At the same time, General Alexander Pavliuk, commander of the Forces and Means of Defense of Kiev, has announced that Ukrainian military forces have formed a special fighting group on the border with Belarus, ready to defend against any potential offensive action. Pavliuk emphasized that fortified positions and long-term defense structures have been established, making it very difficult for any Russian and Belarusian troops to cross the border. He said that the defense system spans approximately 1,000 kilometers of total fortified lines. In an interview with The Economist on December 15, Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhnyi said that Russia is almost certainly preparing for a new large offensive in spring, which could be a second attempt at taking Kiev from the north. On the other hand, Ukraine's military intelligence chief, Kyrylo Budanov, said in an interview published on January 4 that Kiev anticipates the hottest fighting in March as it plans a major push in spring, and there may be further strikes deeper and deeper inside Russia. The department in its daily summary noted that Alexei Danilov, Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, reported on December 27, 2022, that Russia had relocated two 95 ms heavy bombers and two 22 M3 medium bombers to Russia's Far East. On December 5 and December 26, 2022, the Engels 2 air base was struck and several aircraft damaged. Russia has highly likely responded to the incidents by conducting a general dispersal of its bomber aircraft, especially to airfields further away from Ukraine, the agency said. According to UK intelligence, Russia's bomber fleet will still be able to fire air-launched cruise missiles into Ukraine because the weapons have a 5,000-kilometer range, in addition to the flight range of the bombers. An unknown aircraft crashed on the runway of the Engels 2 airfield in Saratov Oblast on the morning of December 5. Satellite images recorded damage to at least one Tu-95 bomber. Another powerful explosion rocked the Engels 2 airfield overnight on December 26, killing at least 3 Russian soldiers. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev on Thursday warned the United States that hypersonic missiles would soon be close to NATO's shores after the U.S. Embassy said in a video it stood in solidarity with Russians who opposed the war in Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has triggered one of the most deadly wars in Europe since World War II and the deepest crisis in Moscow's relations with the West since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Medvedev said the missiles could be placed 100 miles, 160 kilometers, off the U.S. coast. He was speaking after the U.S. Embassy to Russia released a video that it called an appeal to the people of Russia. The 50-second video included images of the impact of bombing in Ukraine, saying what was happening there is not worthy of you. Medvedev, a close Putin ally, lashed out at the video, describing the U.S. government as cynical freaks and sons of bitches, who he said were using the tricks of Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels. Since the war began, Medvedev's rhetoric has become increasingly vitriolic, though his published views sometimes chime with thinking at the top levels of the Kremlin elite. U.S. and Ukrainian officials dismissed Russian President Vladimir Putin's declaration of a unilateral 36-hour ceasefire over Orthodox Christmas, expressing skepticism about the Kremlin's true intentions in calling for a temporary truce. Ukrainian officials rejected Putin's invitation to join the ceasefire as a ploy to regroup his forces and strategize for another offensive. Mikhailo Podolyak, advisor to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, called Putin's ceasefire offer a cynical trap and an element of propaganda on Twitter. On Sunday, a deadly missile attack on military barracks in the Russian-occupied city of Makiyivka killed at least 89 Russian service members, making it the highest single casualty event that Moscow has disclosed since the war began last February. The Ukrainians allege the attack may have killed hundreds. The White House confirmed Thursday that a new military aid package is being prepared for Ukraine and will include armored Bradley fighting vehicles for the first time. The hulking vehicles carry a crew of 3 and are armed with an autocannon, a machine gun, and a missile system that can destroy armored targets, such as tanks, from more than 2 miles away. The announcement came after a phone call between Biden and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who said his nation will send Ukraine infantry fighting vehicles and air defense systems. Earlier, France revealed its plans to provide Ukraine with AMX-10RC armored fighting vehicles. The White House and Defense Department plan a more formal announcement about the latest Ukraine aid package on Friday. The U.S. has committed more than $21 billion in security assistance to Ukraine since Russia's invasion began last February. Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill, a powerful ally of President Vladimir Putin, is embracing the rhetoric of the medieval Crusades in urging support for Moscow's offensive in eastern Ukraine. Keen to ensure public support, Putin declared during his midnight address on New Year's Eve that moral, historical rightness is on our side. He had initially said that the fellow Orthodox Christian nation needed to be demilitarized and denazified. But more than 10 months into Moscow's offensive, Russian authorities, military commanders and propagandists aim to depict the conflict as a battle against the decadent West. In early November, former President Dmitry Medvedev said that Russia faced an existential threat and that the sacred goal was to fight the satanic West. Dozens of Orthodox priests have been sent to the front to support Russian troops. Several Orthodox clerics have died in Ukraine, including Mikhail Vasilyev, who posthumously received from Putin the Hero of Russia award, the country's top honor. The offensive has deepened a rift between the Russian and Ukrainian Orthodox churches. But even in Russia, not every cleric supports the rhetoric of the Moscow Patriarchate. Kordakin was among nearly 300 Russian Orthodox clerics who signed an open letter urging authorities to end the fratricidal war in Ukraine. Russia President Vladimir Putin on Thursday allegedly called on Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu to order a ceasefire in Ukraine in observation of Orthodox Christmas. Given the appeal of His Holiness Patriarch Kirill, I instruct the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation to introduce a ceasefire regime along the entire line of contact between the parties in Ukraine from 12 o'clock on January 6 to 2400 hours on January 7, a statement from the Kremlin chief said according to Russian media outlet RA. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has yet to publicly comment following Putin's order, but an advisor from his office described the ceasefire calls from the Russian Orthodox Church earlier in the day as a cynical trap. The ceasefire order is the first Putin has called for since the war began and comes just 2 days after Zelensky cautioned that Russia was preparing for a major offensive in an attempt to turn the tide in the war. Zelensky said Russia would throw everything they have at Ukrainian forces fighting to oust Russian troops from 5 Ukrainian regions. Additionally, Putin in December ordered his defense officials to overhaul his war effort by reinforcing troops with supplies and equipment they need on the front lines, bolstering missile stockpiles and by making Russia's nuclear triad combat ready.